What is worship? Some people say that only praise is worship. Some say that a certain number of actions within the assembly is worship. Some people say that their whole life is worship, and I assume that this excludes any sinful parts. But what did worship mean in the Bible? Firstly, my emphasis is not on our modern definition of worship, but on the meaning of the Greek and Hebrew words that come to be translated as our word worship. However, it can be informative to see where our word worship comes from. According to my reading, the word worship comes from the Old English word "wiorthscape," which means worthiness. Thus, we could worship someone that is worth the respect that they receive. And within this historical context, it wouldn't be sacrilegious to worship another human being because the older word has a broader scope of meaning than our modern one. At one time, the word worship was also used as a title for various officials. And all of this actually lines up with some of the biblical words that are translated into English as worship. Sometimes you have one word that describes the same action performed for humans and for God that gets different translations depending on the recipient. When performed for people, it's translated as bow, but when performed for God, it's translated as worship. And this is likely to prevent confusion for modern readers because we know that we aren't supposed to worship anyone but God. But words often lack a perfect one-to-one translation between languages, and worship isn't always worship. If we look at the word worship in our Bibles, then go back to the words that they are translated from and look at their meanings, we find things like bow, bend, or prostrate oneself, to fall upon the floor, to venerate, to live piously and reverently, devotion, to fall down and kiss the feet of or the ground before, as in before a king, to kiss like a dog licking its master's hand, to render religious service, and this can include serving God and serving others as a religious act, singing a spontaneous song of praise out of an overflowing of the heart, to kneel, to praise, to make a show of or rave about, to glory in or boast upon, to be clamorously foolish about your adoration of God, to play a musical instrument or make accompaniment by voice, to celebrate in song and music, praises, psalms, etc., to shout praise, to reverence or hold in awe. Well, that's quite a lot to take in, but to summarize, worship generally involves one or more of the following: obedience, praising, and bowing. Obedience includes obeying God's commands, devotion, service to God, and service to others in the name of or because of God. Praising includes words, states of mind or spirit, and forms of music. Bowing shows reverence, humility, and a proper acknowledgement of one's place in the place of God. Prayer can fit into any or all of these at once, depending on the nature of the prayer. Similarly, you might define perfect love towards God as the summation of all of them at once. Obedience, praising, and bowing. None of the biblical words is a perfect synonym for our English word worship, and that's okay. Words frequently lack a perfect one-to-one translation between languages. But it should be noted that none of these words is restricted to group meeting. In fact, none of the biblical words imply or require the modern idea of a worship service. Of course, they did come together to worship, but it wasn't the coming together that made it worship or that made it possible to worship. We often link worship to the assembly of believers, gathered for corporate acts of worship, but the biblical usage is much broader. It includes the Christian moral life and the acts of service that we perform for others in the name of God. The common usage today represents a narrowing down of the biblical meaning. It selects one aspect of worship and applies the word almost exclusively to that aspect. So what about the idea that my whole life is worship, minus the sinful parts, of course? Well, likely not everything is or even could be considered worship directly towards God. That is, intentional, direct thoughts, actions, or words expressed toward God. I mean, sometimes we have to sleep or do complex math or merge into traffic. But virtually any non-sinful act or thought could be what we might call indirect worship by the manner or the spirit in which we could do it. So in summary, what is worship? Obedience, praising, and bowing. Hey, what did you think of the lesson? Tell me in the comments all the places that I was incredibly wrong, because how else am I going to learn? And why don't you hit subscribe and the notify bell so that you can be alerted anytime I have a new lesson come out? And then you can tell me what I got wrong on those too.